Welcome back. I'm Anthony Nicoli, and we are reading from Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology. I'm going to be reading today from the second section in Chapter 1, titled The Enigma of the Inherited Image, and the second section is entitled The Supernormal Sign Stimulus. It is by now a commonplace of biological thought to observe that man, in his character as animal, is born at least a year too soon, completing in the sphere of society a development that other species accomplish within the womb. It has been observed that our hairlessness is a fetal trait, that our numerous psychological difficulties are functions of the prematurity of our birth, and that, to use Nietzsche's picturesque term, we cannot but expect to remain das kranke Tier, the sick animal, throughout life and to the end of our days. It was the great French naturalist Buffon, 1707 to 1788, I believe, who first remarked that man is no more than a decadent ape. And it was a Dutch anatomist, Ludwig Bolk, who in 1926, in a work entitled The Problem of Human Incarnation, gave a scientific foundation to this idea by showing that mutations inhibiting maturation actually occur in animals, and suggesting that the evolution of man must have been affected by a series of such modifications. According to Bolk's view, man has been arrested at a stage of growth represented by a late phase in the development of the embryo of a chimpanzee. A more generous view, however, recognizes in the hairlessness of our species the enhancement of the skin as a sense organ and of the parts of the body as foci of optical interest. For in man, the sensory nerves running through the spine are much more numerous than in any of the furry tribes, while the range and subtlety of the sign stimuli afforded, not only by our nakedness, but also by our various modes of covering and uncovering, it evokes responses of considerably more diversity than those of mere animal appetite and consummation. The hairless face has become an organ of exquisite mobility, capable of a range and refinement of social signaling infinitely more versatile than the social releasers, the bird cries, flourished antlers, and tail flashes of the animal kingdom. The mutation, that is to say, was not negative but positive, and the long gestation going beyond the capacity of the mother's womb to support it was the consequence of an advance, for as Schopenhauer declares, all great things mature slowly. And are we to forget, furthermore, the rapid growth during the first year of extrauterine life of this wonderful head and brain? It is perfectly true that because of the prematurity of our birth, we do not have as many stereotyped key tumbler responses as the other vertebrates, and that having consequently a more open reflex structure than they, we are less rigidly patterned in our instincts, less conservative, dependable, and secure than the animals. But on the other hand, we do have this developed brain, which is 3 times as great in size as its nearest rival, and has given us not only new knowledge, including that of our own inevitable death, but also a capacity to control and even to inhibit our responses. Best of all, however, is the gift of immaturity itself, which has enabled us to retain in our best, most human moments the capacity for play. In puppyhood, animals show a capacity for play when they are protected from the dreadful seriousness of the wilderness by the guardianship of parents, and practically all make a charming display of it in courtship. However, in man, or perhaps we should say rather in the best of men, though indeed in the majority of women, The capacity is retained throughout life. The capacity is retained throughout life. It is, in fact, only those who have failed one way or another in their manhood or womanhood who become our penny dreadfuls, or our gorillas and baboons. In a highly suggestive paragraph, the animal psychologist Konrad Lorenz presents an excellent statement of our indebtedness to this capacity of ours for play, reminding us that every study undertaken by man was the genuine outcome of curiosity, a kind of game. All the data of natural science, which are responsible for man's domination of the world, originated in activities that were indulged in exclusively for the sake of amusement. When Ben Franklin drew sparks from the tail of his kite, he was thinking as little of the lightning conductor as Hertz, when he investigated electrical waves, was thinking of radio transmission. Anyone who has experienced in his own person how easily the inquisitiveness of a child at play can grow into the life work of a naturalist will never doubt the fundamental similarity of games and study. The inquisitive child disappears entirely from the wholly animal nature of the mature chimpanzee. But the child is far from being buried in the man, as Nietzsche thinks. On the contrary, it rules him absolutely. Animals are without speech, and one reason, surely, is their inability to play with sounds. They are without art, and the reason again is their inability to play with forms. Man's capacity for play animates his urge to fashion images and organize forms in such a way as to create new stimuli for himself. Sign stimuli, to which his nervous system may then react much in the way of an isomorph to its releaser. We have observed the case of the little girl, seized by her own creation of a witch. Let us consider now what can happen to a poet. The following statement by the British poet and critic A. Housman supplies the most satisfactory definition I know of a certain triggering principle that is effective in the poetic impact. Poetry seems to me more physical than intellectual. A year or two ago, in common with others, I received from America a request that I would define poetry. I replied that I could no more define poetry than a terrier can define a rat, but that I thought we both recognized the object by the symptoms which it provokes in us. One of these symptoms was described in connection with another object by Eliphaz the Temanite. A spirit passed before my face. The hair of my flesh stood up. Experience has taught me, when I am shaving of a morning, to keep watch over my thoughts, because if a line of poetry strays into my memory, my skin bristles, so that the razor ceases to act. This particular symptom is accompanied by a shiver down the spine. There is another which consists in constriction of the throat and a precipitation of water to the eyes. And there is a third, which I can only describe by borrowing a phrase from one of Keats' last letters, where he says, speaking of Fanny Brawne, everything that reminds me of her goes through me like a spear. The seat of this sensation is the pit of the stomach. The reader hardly need be reminded that the images not only of poetry and love, but also of religion and patriotism, when effective, are apprehended with actual physical responses. Tears, sighs, interior aches, spontaneous groans, cries, bursts of laughter, wrath, and impulsive deeds. Human experience and human art, that is to say, have succeeded in creating for the human species an environment of sign stimuli that release physical responses and direct them to ends no less effectively than do the signs of nature, the instincts of the beasts. No less effectively than do the signs of nature the instincts of the beasts. The biology, psychology, sociology, and history of these sign stimuli may be said to constitute the field of our subject, the science of comparative mythology. And although no one has yet devised an effective method for distinguishing between the innate and the acquired, the natural and the culturally conditioned, the elementary and the ethnic aspects of such human cultural catalysts and their evoked responses, the radical distinction here made by the poet Hausmann between images that act upon our nervous structure as energy releasers and those that serve rather for the transmission of thought supplies an excellent criterion for the testing of our themes. I cannot satisfy myself, he writes, that there are any such things as poetical ideas. No truth, it seems to me, is too precious, no observation too profound, no sentiment too exalted to be expressed in prose. The utmost that I could admit is that some ideas do, while others do not, lend themselves kindly to poetical expression, and that these receive from poetry an enhancement which glorifies and almost transfigures them, and which is not perceived to be a separate thing, except by analysis. When Hausmann writes that poetry is not the thing said, but a way of saying it, and when he states again that the intellect is not the fount of poetry, that it may actually hinder its production, and that it cannot even be trusted to recognize poetry when it is produced, he is no more than reaffirming and lucidly formulating the first axiom of all creative art, whether it be in poetry, music, dance, architecture, painting, or sculpture, which is, namely, that art is not, like science, a logic of references, but a release from reference and rendition of immediate experience. A presentation of forms, images, or ideas in such a way that they will communicate not primarily a thought or even a feeling, but an impact. The axiom is worth recalling here because mythology was historically the mother of the arts, and yet, like so many mythological mothers, the daughter equally of her own birth. Mythology is not invented rationally. Mythology cannot be rationally understood. Theological interpreters render it ridiculous. Literary criticism reduces it to metaphor. A new and very promising approach is opened, however, when it is viewed in light of biological psychology as a function of the human nervous system, precisely homologous to the innate and learned sign stimuli that release and direct the energies of nature, of which our brain itself is but the most amazing flower. So we'll stop there for today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to you joining me again tomorrow.